The call came at 6:14 in the morning. I know the exact time because I had just set my coffee on the kitchen counter and hadn't touched it yet. The display read Marcus Teal and Sons Jewelers. I didn't recognize the name immediately. Then I did, and I picked up. He introduced himself carefully. That was the first thing I noticed. A man who chooses his words that carefully at 6 in the morning is either a lawyer or someone who is frightened. Marcus Teal was not a lawyer. He said he had an item in his shop that he believed belonged to my family. He said he'd found something during his inspection that he didn't think I was aware of. He paused after that. I've interrogated enough people over 30 years to know what a pause like that means. It means the person on the other end is deciding how much to say before they see your face. I told him I'd be there in 40 minutes. I left the coffee on the counter. I didn't finish it, didn't pour it out, just left it sitting there, still steaming faintly. The way you leave something when you don't expect to be gone long, but some part of you already knows you will be. I pulled on my coat and didn't bother with the buttons. It was November. The air outside was sharp and smelled like wet pavement, and I drove the whole way without turning on the radio. Teal and Sons is on Carpenter Street, between a dry cleaner and a framing shop that's been there longer than the jewelry store has. I'd driven past it 100 times without stopping. The sign in the window said, Established 1993, and below that, in smaller letters, Repairs, Appraisals, Estate Pieces. The front door was unlocked, but the shop wasn't officially open. Marcus Teal was waiting for me just inside. He was a man in his late 60s, heavy-set, with reading glasses pushed up on his forehead and the particular stillness of someone who works with small things all day and has learned not to move unnecessarily. He shook my hand without speaking and led me to the back counter, where a single lamp was positioned over a velvet mat. He had already set the item under the light. I recognized it before I sat down. It was a Longines dress watch, white gold case, champagne dial, the small date window at 3 o'clock. Evelyn had worn it every day for 34 years. She wore it on our wedding day, wore it when each of our children was born, wore it to every dinner and every funeral and every ordinary Tuesday that added up to the life we built together. I had not seen it since the week after she died, when Garrett told me he'd put it somewhere safe. Marcus didn't say anything for a moment. He let me look. Then he put on his glasses, picked up a loop, and turned the watch so the case back faced the light. He pointed to a seam along the lower edge of the casing, a line that was slightly off from the original Longines tooling, barely visible without magnification. He said, "This is an original to the watch." I looked at where he was pointing. I said, "Show me." He set down the loop and picked up a thin steel tool from the tray beside him. With the practiced motion of a man who had done this 31 years, he worked the edge of the case back and lifted it away from the body of the watch. Beneath it, where there should have been only the movement and the original plate, there was a small recessed chamber perhaps 3 millimeters deep, no wider than a thumbnail. Inside it, fitted precisely, was a translucent gel disc, pale, almost colorless, the kind of thing you would not notice unless you were specifically looking for it, or unless you were a jeweler who inspected every piece before it went back into circulation. Marcus said, "There's something inside that shouldn't be here, Mr. Holt." I looked at the disc. I looked at the watch. I thought about Evelyn's wrist and the way she always wore the watch face inward, close against her pulse point, because she said she liked to feel the weight of it when she moved. I thought about the last 8 months, the fatigue I'd been explaining away, the tremor in my right hand that Dr. Sue had ordered a second round of tests for, the way some mornings it took me 20 minutes to feel like myself. I sat very still and I looked at my wife's watch under Marcus Teal's lamp, and I understood that I needed to start from the beginning, from the day Garrett brought it to this shop without telling me, from the day he decided what to do with something that was never his to touch. The morning Evelyn died, I drove home from the hospital alone. It was a Tuesday in March, early. Still dark enough that the streetlights were on. I parked in the driveway and sat in the car for a while. The porch light was on. She had asked me to leave it on whenever I came home late, a habit from the first year of our marriage. a habit she never saw any reason to break. I sat in the car looking at that light for longer than I should have. Then I went inside and made coffee and waited for the sun to come up. Evelyn and I had built Holt Freight Solutions together, though her name was never on the paperwork. She handled the books in the first 3 years when we couldn't afford an accountant, sitting at the kitchen table after dinner with a legal pad and a calculator. She understood the business the way she understood most things quietly, completely, without needing to announce it. When I told her in 2019 that I was thinking about stepping back, letting Garrett take the reins, she said, "Raymond, just make sure he's ready." She was already sick by then, though neither of us knew how sick. I told her he was ready. I believed it. Garrett had the resume. An MBA from Vanderbilt, 4 years as a regional operations manager at a national freight company before coming back to work with me. He knew the industry, he knew the margins, the carrier relationships, the regulatory landscape. When he took over as CEO in early 2021, 8 months after Evelyn passed, there was a logic to it that I could follow. The company needed continuity. I was 62 years old, and I had just buried my wife. The timing was not ideal, but timing rarely is. Diane, his wife, made a point of calling me every Sunday that first year. She was attentive in a way that felt genuine, asking about my sleep, about whether I was eating, bringing over food in glass containers that she labeled in her careful handwriting. She had a doctorate in biochemistry from Johns Hopkins and had left her research position to support Garrett's transition. She told me she admired what I had built. She said it often. I thought she meant it. I was not paying close enough attention. That is the thing about grief. It occupies the part of your mind that used to do that work. The Sunday dinners started in September of last year. After Garrett called them a fresh start, he said it would be good for all of us to have a regular meal together, that it was what Evelyn would have wanted. He was not wrong about that, and I did not have a reason to say no. The first few went the way those things go. Garrett would talk about the company. Diane would cook something careful and ask about my sleep. There would be wine, which I didn't drink much of, and then coffee, which I did. I would drive home on Arcadia Boulevard with the radio off and feel, for an hour or two, something that was not quite comfort, but was adjacent to it. The Sunday I remember most clearly was in November. I had arrived at 6, the usual time, and Diane met me at the door the way she always did, taking my coat, asking if I'd eaten lunch. The dining room smelled like rosemary and something else I couldn't name. Garrett was on a call. She said he'd be down in a few minutes. She poured water at the table herself, the way she always did, moving around the setting with the efficiency of someone who had decided long ago that she preferred to do things herself rather than delegate them. She filled my glass first. She always filled my glass first. I had thought of it as a small courtesy. She set the pitcher down and touched the base of it lightly, adjusting it by perhaps a centimeter, and then she looked up and smiled and said, "You look tired. Raymond, you're working too hard." I told her I wasn't working at all, which was true. I had stepped back from day-to-day operations entirely. She said, "That's what worries me." I didn't know what to do with that. I drank the water. Garrett came downstairs a few minutes later, and the conversation moved on, the way conversations do at dinner tables, and I stopped thinking about it. I drove home at 9:30. When I got inside, I noticed my right hand was unsteady, not dramatically. Just a slight resistance when I turned the key in the lock, a tremor that was there and then wasn't. I stood in the front hallway for a moment and flexed my fingers and told myself it was the cold. It was November. That was a reasonable explanation. I went to bed. I did not write it down. That was a mistake I would not make again. Later, much later, after everything, I would remember something Diane had said to me at a different dinner earlier in the year, before the Sunday meals had become a routine. We had been talking about the company, about the Columbus expansion, about the capital Garrett needed. She had been quiet for most of the conversation, the way she usually was when Garrett was making a business case. And then, when Garrett had stepped away from the table, she had leaned forward slightly and said, "Garrett has given everything to this company. Raymond, everything. He deserves what you built. You know that, don't you?" I had said something non-committal. I had thought it was loyalty, the particular loyalty of a wife who believed in her husband more than the evidence required. I had not examined it more closely than that. I examined it now. That sentence, "he deserves what you built," was not a wife defending a husband. It was a woman who had already decided something and was looking for confirmation. She had told herself a story in which Garrett's inheritance was not theft but correction, not crime but justice deferred. She had a doctorate in biochemistry and 6 years of pharmaceutical research, and she had used both to build something precise and patient and lethal. And she had done it while telling herself that Raymond Holt was simply receiving what he had already agreed to give. That was the part I found hardest to set aside, not the act itself, but the architecture of the reasoning that had made it possible. I had met people in 22 years of investigative work who had done terrible things for comprehensible reasons. Diane's reason was comprehensible. That did not make it less terrible. It made it, in some ways, more so. Evelyn's long jeans had been a wedding gift. I had saved for 4 months to buy it. We were married in 1982. I was 24 years old, and a Longines was not something a 24-year-old freight driver could afford without planning. It was a dress watch, simple, with a cream face and a gold case and a brown leather strap that she replaced twice over the decades. She wore it every day for 34 years. Not on special occasions, every day. She wore it face inward, pressed against her pulse point, because she said she liked to feel the weight of it when she moved. I had noticed that habit so many times that I stopped seeing it, the way you stop seeing anything that is constant enough. After she died, I kept the watch in a small wooden box on the top shelf of the bedroom bookcase. The box had belonged to her mother, a plain thing, cedar, with a brass clasp that had turned green at the edges. I did not wind the watch. I did not take it out often, but I knew it was there, and that knowing was something. Grief has its own architecture, and for me, that box on that shelf was a load-bearing wall. I was aware of it the way I was aware of the photograph on my desk and the dent in the kitchen baseboard where she had bumped the corner of a moving box in 1991, and we had never gotten around to fixing it. These things were not shrines. They were just the evidence of a life. I was not ready to remove the evidence. Garrett came to me in February of last year with a proposal. He sat at my kitchen table with a printed summary and explained that the company needed capital to expand the regional hub in Columbus, and that I was holding a significant portion of my personal assets, in illiquid form, the house, a piece of commercial property in the warehouse district that I had owned since 2003, and my remaining equity stake in Holt Freight. He was not wrong about the numbers. The commercial property had appreciated substantially. The equity stake was worth more than it had been. He was making a reasonable business argument. I told him I understood the logic and that I would think about it. What I meant was that I was not going to liquidate anything in the near term, and that I expected him to understand that without my needing to say it directly. We were not the kind of family that required everything to be spelled out, or so I believed. He pushed twice more over the following 6 weeks. The second time he brought Diane, who sat quietly and let Garrett do the talking, which I noticed, but did not examine closely enough. The third time he mentioned, in passing, that some of the investors he was courting had asked about the ownership structure and whether there were any encumbrances. I told him I was not interested in restructuring my personal holdings to make his investor presentations cleaner. He nodded. He said he understood. He left without pressing further, and I thought the matter was settled. 3 weeks after Garrett's third visit, I had lunch with Martin Chu, one of the minority shareholders who had come in during the 2019 round, a quiet man who ran a logistics consulting firm out of Indianapolis and who I had always found straightforward. He had called and asked if I was free, which was unusual enough that I said yes. We met at a restaurant on West Adams that he had chosen. He ordered carefully and talked about the industry for a while, carrier rates, the Columbus market, the regulatory changes coming out of Washington. Then he set down his fork and said, "Raymond, I want to ask you something directly, and I hope you'll take it in the spirit it's intended." I told him to go ahead. He said, "Garrett mentioned at the shareholder call last month that you'd been having some health difficulties. that you'd seen some specialists. He said you were managing it, but that it had affected your availability. He looked at me carefully. I just wanted to make sure you were all right, and to say if there's anything the board should be aware of in terms of continuity planning, it's better to address it early. I looked at him across the table. I had not been to any specialists. I had not missed a single scheduled commitment. I had not told Garrett anything about my health that would warrant that characterization because there was nothing to tell. I had mentioned the fatigue to Anita Sue at a routine appointment. That was all. I said, I appreciate the concern. Martin, I'm fine. Who else was on that call? He told me there were 4 names. 2 of them were board members I had known for 15 years. 2 of them were Garrett's recent additions. I thanked Martin for lunch. I paid the check. I drove back to the house, and I sat in the kitchen for a while without turning on any lights. Garrett had told 4 people, including 2 board members, that his father was in declining health. He had done it on a shareholder call, which meant it was on record. He had done it 3 weeks after I had declined, for the 3rd time, to restructure my personal assets. I had not yet connected the tremor in my right hand to anything other than the cold. That connection was still 6 weeks away. But I sat in the dark kitchen, and I thought about the word continuity. And I thought about the way Garrett had accepted my 3rd refusal without pressing further, and I understood that he had not stopped. He had simply moved to a different room. I should have known better. I spent 21 years as a private investigator before I started Holt Freight. I know what it looks like when someone accepts a refusal too easily. I know the difference between a man who has changed his mind and a man who has decided to work around you. I missed it with Garrett because I was his father, and because fathers are the last people to apply that kind of scrutiny to their own children. That is not an excuse. It is just the truth. The box was empty on a Thursday afternoon in early April. I had gone into the bedroom to find a file I had left on the nightstand, and I noticed the cedar box was not sitting quite right on the shelf slightly forward, as though it had been replaced in a hurry. I opened it without expecting anything. The watch was gone. I called Garrett. He answered on the 2nd ring, which meant he was not surprised to hear from me. He said he had taken the watch to a jeweler to have it cleaned and serviced. He said the leather strap had been showing wear, and he wanted to have it looked at. He said it in the tone of someone explaining something obvious to someone who had perhaps overreacted. He said, Bo Jung Lo, or rather, he said, Dad, don't worry about it. I'll have it back to you in a couple weeks. His voice was even, unconcerned, affectionate. Even in that surface way, he had learned somewhere along the line that I could never quite locate the origin of. I said, which jeweler? He said he would text me the information. He did not text me the information that evening. He did not text me the following day. When I followed up, he said he would check on the timeline and get back to me. He did not get back to me. I told myself there was a reasonable explanation. I told myself that Garrett was careless sometimes. Not malicious, that he had taken the watch with good intentions and had simply failed to follow through on the communication. I told myself this for 3 weeks, which is longer than I should have, but I was 64 years old and tired in a way that had been accumulating for 4 years, and I did not want to believe what the back of my mind was already beginning to suggest. Then Marcus Teal called. It was a Wednesday morning. I was at the kitchen table with coffee and the newspaper, a physical newspaper, a habit I have kept since 1987 when my phone rang from an unknown local number. I let it ring twice before I answered. Another old habit. The man on the other end identified himself as Marcus Teal, owner of Teal & Sons Fine Jewelry on Carver Street. He said he had a Longines dress watch in his shop that had come in through a private sale, and that when he had opened the case to inspect it before resale, as he always did, he had found something inside that was not a factory component. He said he had found my name in the estate registry attached to the watch's original certificate of authenticity, which had been included with the sale. He said he thought I should come in. He said, Sir, I think you need to see what's inside. I set the newspaper down. The coffee had gone cold. I drank what was left of it anyway. Then I picked up the phone and called Frank DeLuca, because 21 years of investigative work had taught me that the first thing you do when you suspect something is wrong is to make sure you have counsel before you take a single step that cannot be taken back. Frank did not ask many questions. He said he would clear his afternoon. I told him I would call him again once I knew what I was looking at. Then I put on my coat and drove to Carver Street, and I walked into Marcus Teal's shop, and I looked at my wife's watch under his lamp. I had not seen it in 3 weeks. The leather strap was still showing the same wear at the second notch, the same small crack in the grain that I had noticed the last time I held it. No one had replaced the strap. No one had cleaned anything. Garrett had not taken it to be serviced. He had sold it. And whatever Marcus Teal had found inside the case, it had been there the entire time, sitting on that shelf in the cedar box, in the bedroom of the house where Evelyn had lived and died for 4 years. I stood at the counter and I looked at the watch and I thought about all of it from the beginning. The invoice was dated 3 weeks ago. Marcus laid it flat on the glass counter under the light, and I read it twice without picking it up. The amount was $2,400. The item description read, Longines Heritage Automatic, Gents circa 1978 brown leather strap, original case. The buyer was listed as a private collector in Scottsdale. The seller was listed as Garrett R. Holt. Not a cleaning fee, not a service charge, a sale. Marcus didn't say anything while I read it. He was the kind of man who understood when silence was more useful than explanation. I'd met men like that in 30 years of investigative work, people who had seen enough of human behavior to know when to stop talking and let the facts do what they were going to do anyway. He stood on the other side of the counter with his hands folded and waited. I set the invoice down. I straightened it along the edge of the counter, the way you straighten something when your hands need something to do. Then I said, "You called me before you sold it to the collector." "I called you the same day your son brought it in." Marcus said, "I hadn't listed it yet. I told him I needed 48 hours to appraise it properly. He said that was fine." He paused. "I'm glad I called when I did." I asked him why he had called at all. A man brings in a watch to sell, that's a transaction. There's no obligation to contact anyone else. Marcus looked at me for a moment. Then he said, "Because when I opened the case to assess the movement, I found something that didn't belong there. And a watch like this, a Longines Heritage from 1978, in this condition, doesn't get brought in by someone who doesn't know what they have. So either the seller knew and didn't care, or the seller didn't know and someone else did." He reached under the counter and brought out a small tray. "I've been doing this for 31 years, Mr. Holt. I know what belongs inside a Longines and what doesn't." He set the watch on the tray. The crystal caught the light the same way it always had, that slight amber warmth that Evelyn had loved. The reason she'd chosen this particular model over the others in the case at Harrington's Jewelers on the day I'd bought it for her. That was 1991. She'd worn it for 29 years. Marcus positioned a lighted magnifier on an articulated arm and angled it over the watch. He worked the case back open with a specialized tool, a thin, flat instrument that fit into the groove with practiced precision, and laid the back cover to the side. Then he turned the watch so I could see the movement under the magnification. The mechanism itself was intact. The rotor, the bridges, the jewels, all original, all clean. But behind the dial, in a space that should have held nothing but the underside of the faceplate, there was a small recessed chamber I wouldn't have known to look for. It was perhaps 8 millimeters across and 2 millimeters deep, and inside it, seated flat against the back of the dial, was a thin pad of material gray, slightly translucent at the edges, with a surface texture that was neither fabric nor plastic. "That's not a gasket," Marcus said. "It's not a friction pad. It's not a movement dampener. And it is not any component that Longines has ever manufactured for this caliber. I cross-referenced the movement specifications before I called you." He straightened up and looked at me directly. "I've opened a lot of watches. Mr. Holt, Longines doesn't have a component like this." I looked at the gray pad for a long time. It was perhaps the thickness of 2 business cards laid together. The edges were cut cleanly, not torn. Not improvised, cut with something precise. Has anyone touched it? I asked. Only with instruments, not with hands. I photographed it in place before I moved anything. He opened a drawer and slid a printed photograph across the counter, the chamber, the pad, the surrounding movement, all in sharp focus under the same magnification. I printed that this morning. I took the photograph. I did not touch the watch itself. I thought about the last 3 months. I thought about the Sunday dinners at Garrett and Diane's house in Arcadia, the ones that had started after Evelyn's 4th anniversary, which Garrett had called a fresh start, a way of keeping the family together. I thought about how Diane would meet me at the door and take my jacket, and how she would say, almost every time, that she loved seeing me wear Evelyn's watch. It's beautiful on you, Raymond. You should wear it more. I had thought it was sentiment. Diane was a careful woman, precise in her language, not given to easy warmth. I had assumed the comment about the watch was her way of bridging a distance she didn't know how to close directly. I thought about the tightness in my right hand that had started in November, the way I'd begun to notice it when I poured coffee in the morning, a slight resistance in the grip, a tremor that wasn't there before. I had attributed it to the cold, then to age. I was 64. Things changed at 64. I had told myself that. I thought about the fatigue that had settled into the base of my skull around the same time, not the fatigue of poor sleep, which I knew well, but a different quality of tired, one that sat behind my eyes and didn't lift after rest. I had mentioned it to Anita Sue at my December appointment, and she had ordered a blood panel. The results had come back within normal range. She had told me to monitor it. I'd been wearing the watch to every Sunday dinner since September. I'd been sitting at Garrett's table, eating Diane's food, wearing Evelyn's watch, and going home afterward with my hand shaking slightly and my head full of a fog I couldn't name. Marcus was watching me. He had the particular stillness of a man who has just shown someone something that cannot be unseen, and who is waiting to find out what they intend to do with it. I said, I need to take the pad with me. I expected that, Marcus said. He had already prepared a small Ziploc evidence bag, the kind with a white labeling strip on the front, the kind I had used myself more times than I could count in a different life. He used tweezers to lift the gray pad from the chamber and seal it inside the bag without touching it with his fingers. He wrote the date and time on the label strip in a clear, even hand and slid it across to me. I put the bag in the inside pocket of my jacket. I put the photograph in the same pocket. Then I took out my phone and called Anita Sue. She answered on the 3rd ring. I could hear the particular background quiet of her office between appointments, the low hum of the HVAC system, the faint sound of a door closing somewhere down the hall. She had been my physician for 12 years. She had been Evelyn's physician before that. When Evelyn was sick, Anita had made house calls on her days off. I had never forgotten that. I told her I needed to speak with her about the blood panels from December. I told her I had a new question. She said, Raymond, I've been looking at those results again myself. Your numbers were within range, but the range is wide. There are things a standard metabolic panel doesn't catch. A pause. I've been thinking about ordering a toxicology screen for some time. I kept telling myself the symptoms were consistent with stress, with grief, with age. But the tremor you described last month, I want to be more precise about what we're ruling out. I said, order the toxicology screen, Anita. Order it today. Another pause. When she spoke again, her voice had shifted, not alarmed, but focused in a way that told me she had already been carrying a concern she hadn't fully named. I'll call the lab this afternoon and have the kit sent to your house by tomorrow morning. Raymond, is there something specific you want me to screen for Hersains and Etsain? I looked at the sealed bag in my jacket pocket. I thought about the gray pad, the hollowed-out casing, the fact that Diane had a doctorate in biochemistry from Johns Hopkins and had spent 6 years in pharmaceutical research before she'd stopped working 3 years ago. I had always assumed she'd stopped because of the move to Arcadia. I had never asked what she had taken with her from that lab. I said, run the full panel, everything, and include heavy metals. Anita said she would have results within 72 hours. I thanked her and ended the call. I stood in Marcus Teal's shop for a moment without moving. The watch was still on the tray, under the magnifier, the case open, the hollow chamber visible and empty now. Marcus had set the gray pad aside in its bag. The photograph was in my pocket. The invoice with Garrett's name on it was still lying flat on the glass counter. I picked up the invoice and folded it once, along its original crease, and put it in my pocket with the photograph and the bag. "The watch," I said. "Don't sell it. Don't list it. I'll be back for it." Marcus nodded. He didn't ask me to sign anything or leave a deposit. He simply picked up the watch, placed it back in its tray, and set it on the shelf behind the counter where I could see it. That was enough. I walked out of the shop and stood on the sidewalk for a moment in the January air. A delivery truck was backing into the loading zone across the street. 2 women were walking a dog the size of a small horse. Everything was exactly as ordinary as it always was. I took out my phone and scrolled to Frank DeLuca's number. Frank had been my attorney for 19 years. He had handled the estate when Evelyn died. He had helped me structure the succession agreement when Garrett took over the company. He was a methodical man, slow to speak, thorough in preparation, and absolutely without sentiment when the situation required it. He picked up on the second ring. I said, "Frank, we need to meet." He said, "When?" I said, "Today." A brief pause. I could hear him moving something on his desk papers or a keyboard. "I have a 4 o'clock that I can push. My office at 3:30. 3:30, I said. "And Frank, pull everything you have on the company succession agreement, the insurance policies, the beneficiary designations, all of it." Another pause, this one longer. Frank DeLuca had known me for 19 years. He knew the difference between a routine question and a request that meant something had already been set in motion. He said, "I'll have everything on the table when you arrive." I put the phone in my pocket and walked to my car. I did not call Garrett. I did not call Carol. I drove to Frank's office through the January streets, and I thought about Evelyn wearing that watch for 29 years. And I thought about the gray pad in the sealed bag against my chest, and I counted the things I did not yet know. There were still many, but there were fewer than there had been an hour ago. "Doctor," Anita Sue called at 7 in the evening. I was standing at the kitchen counter, still in my coat, a glass of water in my hand that I had not yet touched. I recognized her number and answered on the second ring. She said, "Raymond, I have your results." She paused, and in that pause I heard something I had not heard from her in 11 years of her being my physician, a careful arrangement of words before she spoke them. Anita Sue was not a careful woman by nature. She was direct and efficient, and she did not soften things. The pause told me more than the words that followed. She said, "Thallium. The level is low, but the pattern is accumulative. Raymond, someone has been exposing you to this substance over an extended period of time. This did not happen from a single contact. This is months of low-level exposure." I sat down. The kitchen chair scraped against the tile floor, and I sat in my coat with the glass of water still in my hand. I counted to 4 before I said anything. 4 seconds in which I heard the refrigerator hum and a car pass on the street outside, and nothing else. I said, "How long before it becomes irreversible?" She said, "If exposure stops now, your body can clear it. It's slow, but possible. If exposure had continued at this rate," another pause, 6 to 12 months, maybe less, depending on the delivery method. I asked her about the delivery method. She said, "Topical absorption is consistent with what I'm seeing. Prolonged skin contact with a treated surface. Something you touched regularly. Something you wore." She stopped. Then, "Raymond, I need you to come in tomorrow, and I need you to tell me if there's anything you've been in contact with regularly over the past several months that might have been altered." I told her I already knew what it was. I told her I had already had it removed from my possession. I told her I would come in at 9 in the morning and bring documentation. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I'm going to refer this to a toxicologist. And Raymond, this is not something I can keep in the file as a routine result. You understand what I'm telling you." I told her I understood. I thanked her and ended the call. I set the glass of water on the counter. I had not drunk any of it. I looked at the kitchen window, which showed me nothing but my own reflection in the dark glass, a man in a coat, sitting very still. I had spent 22 years as a private investigator learning to read the evidence in front of me without letting the conclusion arrive before the facts did. It was a discipline. It was sometimes the only thing that kept a case from collapsing under the weight of what you wanted to believe. I allowed myself 30 seconds. Then I picked up the phone and called Frank DeLuca. He answered on the first ring. I said, "Anita called. Thallium. Topical. Accumulative. Months of exposure." I heard him exhale, not sharply, but slowly, the way a man exhales when something he feared has been confirmed. I said, "Tell me what you found." Frank said, "Come to the office. Bring the medical documentation when you have it. I need you to see this in person." I left the kitchen light on and drove through the January streets for the second time that evening. Frank's office was on the 4th floor of a building on West Monroe that smelled like old carpet and radiator heat. He had been there for 27 years. The receptionist had gone home, and he met me himself at the door, a man in his mid-60s with reading glasses pushed up on his forehead and a yellow legal pad in his hand covered in his small, precise handwriting. He had a second folder on the conference table. He did not offer coffee. He sat down and opened the folder. He said, "The life insurance policy. The original was filed in 2014, $3 million payout. Standard beneficiary designation to Garrett and Carol in equal shares. I pulled the current file from Northwestern Mutual this afternoon." He turned the folder around so I could see it. "There's an amendment filed 8 months ago. The payout was changed to $18 million. Single beneficiary Garrett, with Carol listed as secondary contingent." I looked at the document. The amendment was 2 pages. It was signed, notarized, and dated. I said, "I didn't sign this." Frank said, "No, you didn't." He pointed to the signature line. "Garrett signed it under a power of attorney designation, the 2019 administrative authorization you gave him for company paperwork, routine filings, vendor contracts, HR documentation. He used that instrument to authorize the amendment." I looked at the date on the amendment. I looked at it for a long moment. Then I looked at Frank. I said, "When was the watch brought in for cleaning?" Frank said, "According to the receipt Marcus Teal provided 3 weeks after this amendment was filed." I set the document down on the table. The radiator ticked in the corner of the room. I thought about the 2019 authorization, a document I had signed on a Tuesday afternoon in this same office because Garrett had said it would simplify the administrative load during the transition. He had explained it clearly and reasonably. He had a folder of examples. He had answered every question I asked. I had signed it because it was a reasonable request from a son who was taking on a significant responsibility, and because I had believed, at that time, that reasonable requests deserved reasonable trust. Frank said, "There's something else." He pulled a second sheet from the folder. "The notary who certified the amendment. Her name is Patricia Vance. She works out of a firm in Schaumburg. I called her this afternoon." He looked at me over his reading glasses. "She agreed to meet. I think you should hear it from her directly." Patricia Vance was a small woman in her late 50s with silver-framed glasses and the particular stillness of someone who had spent decades watching people sign their names to things they did not always understand. She had driven 40 minutes to Frank's office, and she sat across from me with her hands folded on the table, and she did not appear nervous. She appeared resolved. She said, "The man who brought in the documents told me it was a routine amendment requested by the senior Mr. Holt. That's the language he used. Senior Mr. Holt. He said you were traveling and had authorized your son to handle the paperwork on your behalf, which was consistent with the power of attorney he presented." She looked at me steadily. I had no reason to question the power of attorney. It was a properly executed document. I said, "Did you ask to speak with me directly?" She said, "I asked if you were available by phone. He said you were in a meeting and would be unreachable until the following week." She paused. I should have waited. I have thought about that since your attorney called me this afternoon. I should have waited and verified with you personally. The power of attorney permitted the transaction, but I should have waited." She unfolded her hands and folded them again. "I want to be clear about something. If this goes to a proceeding, I will testify to exactly what I've told you. The man who presented those documents told me the request originated with you. That was the representation made to me. I did not independently verify it because I was given a reason not to, and I accepted that reason. I should not have." She looked at Frank, then back at me. She said, "I've been a notary for 26 years. I know what a fraudulent authorization looks like after the fact. This is what it looks like." I thanked her. She nodded once, gathered her coat, and Frank walked her to the elevator. I sat at the conference table and looked at the two documents side by side, the toxicology summary Anita had sent to my phone, and the insurance amendment with Garrett's signature at the bottom. The numbers were very clear. $18 million. 3 weeks before the watch was brought to Marcus Teal. 6 to 12 months before the exposure would have reached a fatal threshold. I had interviewed suspects for 22 years. I had sat across from people who had done terrible things, and I had learned to recognize the architecture of a plan, the sequence, the preparation, the contingencies. What I was looking at had an architecture. It had been designed carefully by someone who understood documents and timelines and the way that grief makes people careless with signatures. I thought about Garrett handing me the watch in the hospital corridor 4 months ago. He had held it out in both hands. He had said, "The jeweler did a beautiful job. It looks exactly the way Mom used to wear it." I had taken it from him and put it on my wrist, and I had thought about Evelyn, and I had not thought about anything else. I thought about Diane saying 3 weeks later at Sunday dinner, "You look better. Raymond, you really do." She had smiled when she said it. It was a warm smile. She had refilled my water glass herself. Frank came back into the room and sat down. He looked at the two documents and then at me. I said, "I need to make a call." I took out my phone and found the number I had not used in 4 years. Renata Osei, Special Agent, FBI Chicago Field Office, Financial Crimes and Public Corruption. We had worked together in 2011 on an insurance fraud case that had taken 14 months and produced 3 federal indictments. She was methodical and she was thorough, and she did not move until the evidence was complete. She answered on the 3rd ring. I said, "Renata, it's Raymond Holt." A brief pause. Then Raymond, "It's been a while." I said, "I need to meet with you. Not as an investigator, as a victim." I heard the shift in her attention, the particular quality of silence that meant she was already listening differently. I said, "I have a toxicology report, a fraudulent insurance amendment, and a notary prepared to testify. My son is the subject." She said, "When?" I said, "Tomorrow morning." She said, 7:30, my office. Bring everything." I said I would. I ended the call and set the phone face down on the table. Frank was watching me. He had known me long enough to know that I was not going to say anything that needed to be said out loud. He gathered the documents and slid them into a new folder read. With a tab, he labeled in his small handwriting. He set it in front of me and said, "I'll have copies made tonight." I picked up the folder. I put on my coat. I walked to the elevator and rode it down to the lobby and pushed through the glass door into the January air, which was very cold and very clear. I stood on the sidewalk for a moment. Above me, the city made its ordinary sounds: traffic, wind, a train somewhere to the north. I had 37 years of marriage in that watch. I had worn it for 4 months. I had shaken my son's hand and thanked him for having it cleaned. I walked to my car and drove home. The notification went out on a Thursday, a formal board meeting request, distributed to all 7 voting members of Holt Logistics Group, plus 3 outside counsel representatives, the company's chief financial officer, and the lead accountant. Garrett had also included 2 minority shareholders who had joined the company 5 years ago and whose votes he had been cultivating, according to Frank, since the previous spring. The subject line read, "Emergency Session Governance and Continuity Planning." The body of the email cited, in careful corporate language, The founders documented health decline and the need to ensure operational stability for all stakeholders. Carol received her invitation at 9:14 that same Thursday morning. She called me at 9:31. I didn't answer. I was already on the phone with Frank. The meeting was scheduled for the following Tuesday at 2 o'clock in the main conference room on the 11th floor of the Holt Logistics Building on Meridian Avenue, the building I had purchased in 1994 when Garrett was 11 years old and Carol was 7, when Evelyn had stood in the empty lobby and said the light was good, and that was reason enough. Frank had been working for 6 days without a full night's sleep. Agent Osei had been working longer than that. When I told her the meeting date, she said, "That's enough time." I told her I knew. I did not call Garrett. I did not call Diane. I did not call anyone at the company to say I had received the notification, that I was aware of what Tuesday meant, that I had any opinion about it at all. Garrett believed I was at home, resting, managing symptoms that his wife had designed to be manageable, debilitating enough to justify a governance transfer, not so acute that I would be hospitalized and examined too closely. He had calibrated the whole thing with the precision of a man who had married a biochemist for reasons that went beyond love. I arrived at the building at 1:47 on Tuesday afternoon. I had not been inside since December. The lobby smelled the same recycled air and the faint trace of the cleaning product the overnight crew had used for as long as I could remember. The security desk was staffed by a man named Dennis, who had worked that post for 9 years. He looked up when I came through the door, and his face did something complicated, relief and alarm at the same time. He said, "Mr. Holt, good to see you, sir." I told him it was good to see him too. I signed the visitor log, which I had never had to do before because my name was on the deed of the building. I signed it anyway. I wanted a record of the time. Frank came through the door 2 minutes after me. Agent Osei came through 30 seconds after Frank. She was in a dark jacket, her FBI credentials on her belt, where they could be seen without being announced. She had 2 agents with her who positioned themselves near the elevator bank without drawing attention. Frank was carrying a folder, dark blue, thick, already tabbed at 4 separate points. He handed me a copy of the indictment summary without a word. I put it in my coat pocket without reading it. I had already read it 4 times. We rode the elevator to the 11th floor. Frank stood on my left. Agent Osei stood slightly behind me on my right. The elevator was quiet. I looked at my reflection in the brushed steel of the door. I was wearing the same suit I had worn to Evelyn's memorial service. I had not planned that. I noticed it only when I was already in the car, and I decided it was fine. The conference room doors were closed. Through the narrow glass panel set into the door, I could see the room was full. Garrett was standing at the far end, in front of a projection screen that displayed the Holt Logistics logo and beneath it, in clean sans serif font, the words Continuity and Governance Transition Proposed Framework. He was dressed well. He had his mother's posture straight, composed, the kind of stillness that reads as confidence until you know what it's covering. He was speaking, and whatever he was saying, the room was listening. I could see Howard Birch, the company's chief accountant, who had been with me since 1998, seated halfway down the left side of the table, his hands flat on the surface in front of him, not taking notes. Diane was in the far corner, to Garrett's right. She was seated, her arms crossed, her expression neutral. She was watching the room the way a person watches something they have already decided the outcome of. Carol was in the second row of chairs along the wall, the observer seats, not the table wearing a gray coat she hadn't taken off. She was watching her brother. Her face was attentive and still, and I understood in that moment that she had come because she needed to see it for herself. She had called me that Thursday morning, and I hadn't answered, and she had spent 5 days deciding what to do with that silence. I pushed open the door. The sound of the room changed immediately, not silence, but a shift in attention, the kind that happens when something enters a space that wasn't expected. Garrett stopped speaking mid-sentence. His eyes found me, and for 1 full second, nothing moved in his face. Then something did move, a small tightening around the jaw, a recalibration. He said, "Dad." His voice was steady. I gave him credit for that. I walked to the head of the table, the chair at the head, the founder's chair, As Howard had always called it, the one with the slightly higher back that Evelyn had picked out in 1994 was empty. Garrett had left it empty. I didn't know if that was deliberate or an oversight, and I decided it didn't matter. I pulled it out and sat down. I reached into my coat pocket and set the Longines watch on the table in front of me. I set it face up, the way Evelyn used to rest it on her nightstand. Then I looked at Garrett and said nothing. He looked at the watch. I watched him look at it. I watched the moment he recognized it, and not the recognition of an object, but the recognition of what the object meant, what it represented, what its presence in this room at this table told him about the distance between what he had believed and what was true. His eyes moved from the watch to my face, and then back to the watch, and for 2 full seconds, he was absolutely still. The composure held. He was his mother's son. In that way, she had always been able to hold herself together longer than the situation deserved. But the stillness was different from the stillness he'd had when I walked in. That one had been confidence. This one was calculation, running fast and finding nothing. I said, "Your mother wore this every day for 29 years. I said it quietly. The way you say something that doesn't require a response. He didn't give one. He opened his mouth and then closed it. And in that half second, I saw him understand that there was no version of this room in which the explanation he'd prepared would be sufficient. He had prepared for a father who was confused and diminished. He had not prepared for this. Agent Osei stepped forward. "Mr. Garrett Holt, I'm Special Agent Renata Osei, Federal Bureau of Investigation." She held up her credentials. The room went very still. "I have a federal warrant for your arrest on charges including attempted murder by poisoning, securities fraud, and conspiracy to commit wire fraud. You have the right to remain silent." Agent Osei stepped forward. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. She said, "Mr. Garrett Holt, I'm Special Agent Renata Osei, Federal Bureau of Investigation." She held up her credentials. The room went very still. "I have a federal warrant for your arrest on charges including attempted murder by poisoning, securities fraud, and conspiracy to commit wire fraud. You have the right to remain silent." She kept reading. The words were precise and procedural, and they filled the room completely. I watched Garrett's face as she read. The composure held for the first few sentences longer than I expected, and then it didn't. It didn't collapse all at once. It came apart the way a structure comes apart when the load-bearing element is removed, not dramatically, but completely, 1 degree at a time, until the whole thing was unrecognizable. When Agent Osei reached Diane's name, I heard a sound from the observer chairs along the wall. I turned. Carol had stood up. She was looking at her brother, then at Diane, then back at her brother. She stood there for a long moment, long enough that the 2 agents near the door shifted slightly, and then she sat back down. She didn't say anything. She put both hands in her lap and looked at the table. Her face had the specific quality of a person who has just understood something they had been working very hard not to understand. She had known something was wrong. She had told herself reasons. She had picked the reasons that allowed her to keep attending Sunday dinners and answering her brother's calls and believing that the version of him she had grown up with was still the version that existed. I watched her face, and I did not look away. I thought she deserved to have someone witness what that moment cost her. Howard Birch was seated 4 chairs down from me on the left. When the second agent moved toward Garrett with the handcuffs, Howard turned to the man sitting next to him, one of the minority shareholders, a man named Ted Pratt, who had joined the company in 2019, and said, quietly enough, that he probably thought only Ted could hear. I knew something was wrong from April. The insurance paperwork. I asked about it twice. Ted didn't respond. Howard looked back at the table. Then he did something I did not expect. He stood up. He was 61 years old, Howard Birch. And he had been in this room for 19 years, through the expansion, through the recession, through Evelyn's illness and the succession and everything that had followed. He was not a demonstrative man. In 19 years, I had seen him raise his voice once, at a vendor who had falsified a delivery manifest, and he had done it quietly enough that the man in the next office hadn't heard. He stood up now, and he looked at me across the length of the table, not at Garrett, not at the agents, not at the projection screen still showing the governance framework that would never be implemented. At me. He said, "I should have called you in April. Raymond, I should have called you the day I saw the insurance paperwork, and I didn't. I'm sorry for that." His voice was the same voice he used in every meeting, measured, precise. It did not waver. I looked at him for a moment. I said, "I know. Howard." He nodded once. He sat back down. He set his hands flat on the table the same way he'd had them before I walked in, and he didn't move them. Garrett said, "Dad." He said it once more when the handcuffs went on. "Dad, this is a misunderstanding. Just there's an explanation for all of this. If you'll just—" I looked at him. I had been his father for 38 years. I had taught him to ride a bicycle in the parking lot of the church on Clement Street. I had sat in the back of his college auditorium and watched him accept an award I hadn't known he'd been nominated for. I had stood next to him at his mother's funeral and felt his hand on my shoulder and believed, in that moment, that we were the same kind of grief. I looked at him now, and I tried to find the version of him I had known in the version that was standing in handcuffs in the conference room of the company he had tried to take from me by poisoning me slowly through his wife's research. I looked down at the watch. The crystal face caught the light from the overhead panels, the same panels I had approved when we renovated this floor in 2011, the same warm temperature Evelyn had specified because she said cold light made people look like they were already dead. The watch reflected that light in a small oval on the table's surface. I had 37 years of marriage inside that watch. Not the gel that was gone, removed and cataloged and sitting in an FBI evidence locker, but the years themselves. The weight of them. The way Evelyn had worn it on her left wrist and tapped the crystal face when she was thinking. A habit she'd had since before I knew her. Agent Osi guided Garrett toward the door. Diane stood from her corner chair without being asked. One of the other agents positioned himself beside her. She walked out without looking at anyone in the room. She walked out the way a person walks when they have decided that composure is the last thing they have left to control, and they intend to keep it. The room was very quiet after they left. The projection screen still showed the Holt Logistics logo and the words continuity and governance transition proposed framework. Someone would have to close that file eventually. I didn't move to do it. Frank set his folder on the table and opened to the first tab. He said, "To the room. I'll need 30 minutes of everyone's time to walk through the corrected documentation." His voice was the same voice he used for every meeting, measured, precise, entirely without drama. The founder retains full voting authority and majority ownership. Nothing filed today has legal standing. We'll go through it point by point. Howard Birch uncapped his pen. He opened his notebook to a fresh page. He had been doing that in this room for 19 years, and the motion was so practiced it looked like breathing. I picked up the watch. I held it for a moment, the weight of it, the particular coolness of the case, the way the crown felt under my thumb. Then I put it in my coat pocket. I rested my hand flat on the table, the way Evelyn used to rest hers when she was listening to something she wanted to remember. Frank began to speak. I listened. Garrett was charged 11 days after the board meeting. The formal indictment ran to 43 pages: attempted murder in the first degree, conspiracy to commit murder, insurance fraud, and falsification of legal documents. Agent Osei told Frank that the thallium evidence alone would have been sufficient for the attempted murder charge, but the insurance modification paperwork, the copy Patricia Vance had retained in her files, time-stamped 3 weeks before the watch was brought in for cleaning, established premeditation in a way that removed any reasonable doubt about intent. Diane was charged separately, unlawful manufacture and deployment of a toxic substance, conspiracy, and 2 counts of aggravated assault. The prosecutor's office listed Raymond Holt as the primary victim on both indictments. They listed Evelyn Holt's estate as a secondary party because the watch had been her property. And what had been done to it had been done to something that was never Garrett's to touch. The insurance company moved quickly. Within 2 weeks of the charges being filed, the modified policy was voided in its entirety. The $18 million payout was canceled. The original $3 million policy, the one Evelyn and I had taken out together in 1994, the one I had paid premiums on for 30 years, was reinstated without dispute. I didn't need the money. That wasn't the point. The point was that someone in a building I'd never visited had sat down with a document and a pen and decided how much my life was worth. And that number had been $18 million. And now it was nothing because I was still alive to object. The board met again 10 days after the indictments. The vote to restore full operational authority to Raymond Holt was unanimous. Howard Birch abstained not because he opposed it, he told Frank afterward, but because he felt it was not his place to vote on a matter that should never have required a vote. I understood that. Howard had been in that room a long time. He had seen things. He knew the difference between a procedural correction and an acknowledgement of something that could not be undone by a show of hands. I went back to the office on a Thursday. I didn't make an announcement. I parked in the same spot I had used for 22 years, walked through the side entrance, and went upstairs. My assistant, a woman named Loretta, who had been with the company for 14 years, looked up when I came through the door. She didn't say anything. She stood up, walked to the credenza along the wall, and poured coffee from the carafe she kept there. She set it on my desk. Then she sat back down and opened her calendar. "You have a call at 10, she said. "Freight carrier out of Memphis. I moved it twice. I didn't think it should be moved again." I told her she was right. I sat down. The chair was the same chair. The desk was the same desk. The window looked out over the same yard, the same row of loading bays, the same water tower with the company name painted on it in letters that needed repainting. I had been meaning to get that done for 2 years. Garrett's arraignment was on a Friday morning in February. I did not attend. Frank went and called me afterward from the courthouse steps. He said Garrett had entered a not guilty plea, which was expected. He said Garrett's attorney, a man from a firm in the Loop who specialized in white-collar defense, had requested bail and been denied on the grounds of flight risk. Frank said Garrett had looked at the floor when the bail decision was read. He said Diane's arraignment was the following Monday. Separate proceeding. Same result. Frank said she had walked in and walked out with the same expression she'd had, leaving the conference room controlled, forward-facing, the composure of a woman who had decided that whatever happened next, she would not give anyone the satisfaction of watching her come apart in public. The trial date was set for 11 months out. Frank said it would likely move cases like this, always moved, but that the evidence was clean and the timeline was documented and the prosecutor's office was not looking for a plea. They wanted the full record. I told Frank I understood. I told him to keep me informed and to call me if anything changed. He said he would. I did not hear from Garrett after the arraignment. I had not expected to, but I had thought, in some part of myself I had not examined closely, that he might call, that there might be a moment, now that the architecture of the plan had collapsed completely, in which he would say something true. He didn't call. His attorney sent a letter through Frank's office 2 weeks after the arraignment, requesting that I consider the possibility of a character reference in exchange for cooperation with the prosecution's investigation into related financial irregularities. Frank told me about the letter. I told Frank to decline. That was the last communication. Carol came 3 weeks later. She knocked at the back door, the kitchen door, the one the family always used, and when I opened it, she was standing on the step with her coat still buttoned, holding nothing. I let her in. She sat at the kitchen table, the same table where she and Garrett had done homework 35 years ago, and I put coffee in front of her. She held the mug with both hands the way people do when they are cold, even though the room is warm. She said, "Garrett told me you were losing your mind, that you were confused, that you needed to be protected from yourself." She looked at the table when she said it. He said the doctors had confirmed it, that there were tests. She stopped. I believed him. I said, "I know." She looked up then. Her eyes were dry, which surprised me. Carol had always cried easily at graduations, at funerals, at the end of films that didn't warrant it. She wasn't crying now. "I should have called you," she said. "I should have come and looked at you myself and asked you directly. I didn't do that." "No," I said, "you didn't." She put the mug down. She said, "Dad, can you forgive me?" I didn't answer right away. I looked out the window above the sink, the one that faces the backyard, the oak tree that Evelyn planted the year Carol was born, which is now taller than the house. I looked at it for a while. "I'll forgive you when I'm ready," I said. "I'm not ready yet." She nodded. She didn't argue. She sat for a while longer, finished her coffee, and then she stood up and buttoned her coat again and left through the same door she'd come in. I watched her walk to her car. She didn't look back. I thought that was the right instinct to just keep walking. She called a week later. It was a Tuesday evening, just after 7, and I was at the kitchen table with the newspaper. I let the phone ring twice, an old habit, and then I picked up. She didn't say anything for a moment. I could hear her breathing, and the particular background quiet of her apartment, and somewhere a television at low volume. Then she said, "I just wanted to make sure you were eating." I said, "I'm eating." She said, "Okay." Neither of us said anything else for a few seconds. It was not an uncomfortable silence. It was the silence of two people who have said the necessary things and are not yet ready for the unnecessary ones. I said, "The oak tree in the backyard is going to need trimming in the spring. The east branch has been growing into the fence line for 2 years. I keep meaning to call someone." She said, "I can call someone. I know a crew that does good work." I said, "All right." She said, "I'll send you the number." She did. About an hour later, in a text message with no other words attached. I saved the number to my contacts. I did not call it that evening, but I did not delete it either. I went to Marcus Teal 2 days after that. I brought the watch in its original cloth pouch, the one Evelyn had kept it in, the one I had found in the nightstand drawer the morning after I'd brought the watch home from the board meeting. I set it on the glass counter and told Marcus what I needed: remove the chamber, replace every component that had been altered, restore it to the original Longhini's specification. He unwrapped the pouch and looked at the watch for a long moment without picking it up. Then he put on his loupe and examined it the way he'd examined it the first time, when he'd found the chamber, when he'd made the call that had started everything. He said, "I can do that. 2 weeks." I said 2 weeks was fine. He called on a Thursday. I drove over that afternoon. He had the watch on a square of dark velvet on the counter, and when I came in, he didn't say anything. At first, he just let me look at it. The case was clean. The crystal was polished. Through the exhibition back, I could see the movement turning the way it was supposed to turn, the way it had turned for 40 years before anyone had thought to hollow out a space inside it for something that was never meant to be there. Marcus put it in a small hinged box, dark blue, and slid it across the counter. "No charge," he said. I picked up the box. "Marcus," I said. He shook his head once. That was all. I drove home on the same route I always drove. When I got back, I went upstairs to the bedroom and took the wooden box off the shelf, the one Evelyn had kept on her side, the one with the brass latch that had always stuck slightly and still did. I opened it. I set the watch inside on the velvet lining, the crown facing up, the way she always kept it. Then I closed the lid. I didn't put it on. I didn't hold it. I just placed it in the box and pressed the latch until it caught. And then I set the box back on the shelf in the same spot it had occupied for 4 years, and I went downstairs to make dinner. The oak tree outside the kitchen window was bare. It was that time of year. By March, it would have leaves again, and by May, it would be full enough to throw shade across the back porch the way it always did. The way Evelyn used to sit in on Sunday mornings with her coffee and her book and whatever she was thinking about that she never quite got around to saying out loud. I put water on the stove. I waited for it to boil.